break to our final conference of Sincere, and of course with the Nobel project there as well, an event organized in cooperation between the Sincere and the Nobel project. We're looking in this last session, this conference, on the business models for forest ecosystem services. My name is Mark Ramberger. I'm with Prospects Institute. We're part of the Sincere project. Now, we actually will go into what we hope will be quite an interesting session that we have here for you. And what we will talk about and what we would like to achieve in this session is, well, building really the business case for innovative mechanisms for forest ecosystem services in Europe. So the business case is our focus. And as part of that, we definitely would like to share with you some relevant results from the two projects, Sincere and Nobel, two European Union funded projects within the framework of the Horizon 2020 program. There's a new program coming up, but this is still funded under the old one, so to say, the Horizon 2020. Now, what we also would like to have is a plain talk on this business perspective, so that we really identify how to move forward with the insights that we have gathered within the project and during the session, of course. So the plain talk on the business perspective is really something that we would like to see as well. We have with us a large group of participants. We're very happy about that. We also have with us the two project leaders of the Sincere project, Georg Winkel from the European Forestry Institute and Harald Wacek from the Nobel project. Now, instead of asking you to give a formal presentation, because I think many participants have been in one or the other sessions of this conference. So Georg and Harald, could you tell us in just a few sentences, why is your project so important? Georg, could you start? Why do we need to spend time on what the Sincere project has done?
Yeah, thank you, Mark. Now it's the third time that we're introducing the projects, and I think it's indeed a good idea to change a bit the format. Why Sincere is so important? I think it is important because it looks at this critical question of how to better align the societal demand for forest ecosystem services, so for the many services our forests provide in Europe, with the perspective of forest managers and owners on the other side, with what they are able to provide through management options of their forest. And so Sincere is a project funded by Horizon 2020 with, I believe now 23 partners, several from research, but importantly also many of them from forest management practice, conservation, or think tanks that are collaborating. Our objectives are, broadly speaking, to look into concrete innovation actions on the ground. So how really new things that develop in terms of multiple forest ecosystem services are emerging, including some interesting business models. But it's also to look a bit into the broader factors of across Europe. How do land managers, forest owners perceive changing demand, changing possibilities to engage in innovation? And we also have this idea to provide policy support so that the things we are working on, that we can transport this a bit in recommendations and ideas for this quite dynamically evolving EU forest policy framework. I mean, many of the partners are in the call. We have no time to go deeper, but I think we will for sure see some interesting outcomes of the Sincere project in the discussion we will have today. Thank you.
Thank you, Georg, for that very brief introduction on Sincere and also the link, in fact, to business. You were talking about demand, but there are many other aspects of, let's say, the business case that we will look at during this session. Harald Wacek from the Nobel project. Why is the Nobel project something we should spend some time on?
I think one of the key aspects that we have learned from the past two sessions, session 1 and session 2, is that we need some more testing, and we need the interaction of different actors, the interaction of different disciplines. And I think that's a key issue that we would like to focus on in our Nobel project with our pilot demonstrations, so that we are able really to identify these business relations that we are now going to talk also in this session, and trying to know what are the barriers, what are the hindering factors, what are somehow the elements that lead to success. And I think from that perspective, it's very important to bring together, on the one hand, the scientists with all their competences on the methods, on the models, on the tools that can be applied in a certain context. By the other hand, bringing also the expertise from the stakeholders, from the actors in the actual projects, with their worries, with their hopes, with their preferences, with their expectations into the project, and bringing them together this and mixing this up to make somehow payments for ecosystem services a success. That's, I think, the key issue of the Nobel project, trying to identify those combinations of, on the one hand, business models and mechanisms that can help to internalize the socioeconomic effect and value of forest ecosystem services, and also combine then also with the right policy instruments that help us then to implement these payments for forest ecosystem services at multiple levels, so on the state level or regional level or national level. And I think making somehow such mechanisms then workable requires a lot of time and a lot of efforts and a lot of issues. And I think the 2 days of our conference gives also a good overview about these different attempts to learn from each other and to see what can these projects, or what kind of insights can this project provide. So that's all from my side. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Harald Wacik, for giving us that idea of the Nobel project. And again, many of you have already heard and learned much more about these two projects. And if you haven't, this is a good opportunity, and there's much more further information available for you, and of course the ability to exchange within this session and further with the participants. Glad to be of help from the Nobel and the Sincere projects. Payment for ecosystem services is one of those things that connects those two projects. And here in this session, again, we would like to talk about the business case. How would we like to do that? This is our agenda. We have now a short introduction. And after that introduction, we go into 4 different subjects, one after the other. And each time we'll hear an impulse presentation, first from Dennis Heutsch from the European Forest Institute, then on the demand for FES, then an impulse presentation on the income streams for forest ecosystem services from Sven Wunder, also from the European Forest Institute. And then we move to the financing for FES. This is an impulse that we're going to hear from Bo Jersmark Thorsen from the University of Copenhagen. And then we move finally to the successful FES business models, forest ecosystem services, business models, an outline of that we get from Nelson Grima and Georgia Bataro. Now, that is something we won't get in one go, but we'll take one after the other. And ladies and gentlemen, each time that we've heard an impulse presentation, we will then have first, as an opener, so to say, a discussion with 3 distinguished panelists that I'll introduce to you in just a moment. And that opens then up the floor for our discussion. So after each of those topics and the introductions with an impulse we're going to get, there is the opportunity to first discuss with them among the panelists, get their reaction from the specimen perspective, and then open up the floor before we go into the next one. Now, who are our panelists that we have asked to join? We're very happy that they actually did join us here. It is Paula Grimaresch. She's a sustainability manager with 25 years experience at the Navigator Company. Most of you know the Navigator Company. For those who don't, it's a large, very large internationally active paper and pulp company, so very important player and very active in this field of forest ecosystem services. We have also with us from the European Investment Bank, Vasco Ferreira Costa, who's a senior structured finance officer. So he's working specifically on infrastructure financing, but also in the area of climate financing, climate activity financing, biodiversity. So he'll be able to provide also a very specific perspective also on the bankability and many other related issues that are important for business models here. And last but certainly not least, we have the European Landowners Organization with us, with Alice Bunyok. She's the Director of Legal and Administrative Affairs at ELO. So we're very happy for having you also on board here to give us always a first little perspective on what we hear, and in terms of getting actually to plain talk and saying, what can we take from here? Are these interesting points? How do we need to move on to make this payment for ecosystem services, the business model behind that, something that is attractive, workable, and that we can go with further. Now, we're going to move to the first topic, and my colleague Katharina Farad, who's in Berlin, I'm based here now in Brussels, and yeah, we are online, so we are based, all of us are based somewhere in Europe or even the world, and joining us for this event. Now, Katharina, you'll let us know whom we can hear on this very important topic of the demand for ecosystem services.
Thank you so much, Mark. And yes, hello to Brussels here from Berlin, and to everybody else, of course, in this call. I'm happy to see so many names and faces back from this morning. That's very nice and encouraging. Yeah, we will start with the very first presentation, an impulse presentation, really to just trigger and provide some food for thought on the demand for forest ecosystem services by Dennis Reusch. He works at the European Forest Institute, focusing on in his work on a better understanding of societal perceptions and governance arrangements in the context of urban forest as nature-based solutions. So Dennis, the floor is yours for your short impulse presentation. If you want to share your screen, make yourself visible. Yeah. Yes, we see you.
Hello,
That's
everyone.
wonderful.
So,
we see and hear you. That's good. And we see your slides.
okay, excellent. Then I'll just put on the timer so that I don't forget and overshoot. Okay, then let's start. Yeah, well, thank you for the kind introduction. Yeah, as was already said, I will present. Just move this away. Okay, I think now we can go. On the demand for forest ecosystem services, or in other words, it's an analysis of the societal perceptions towards forests in Europe and also China. And this comes from, yeah, basically work that I did, but also many other colleagues that I've listed there. And it's also one of the outcomes of Clearinghouse project. Now I'm introducing another project, but it's China-Europe research collaboration on urban forests primarily as nature-based solutions. But this presentation here today, Georg said it earlier, it connects a little bit to what Marco Lovric presented already on forest owners and FES. As well as what Helga presented on changing societal perceptions. So let's get right into it. I structured it in the following way. So I'll first just briefly say what we aim for with the study, how we collected the data, and then present different results that are preliminary. They are at this moment in time still based on raw data mainly. With a more and a thorough analysis coming very soon. And last but not least, I will provide a short summary of the report of the presentation also. So what did we set out to do? It was to use an online survey and then to systematically and representatively analyze societal perceptions and demands towards forests, parks, and trees in Europe and China. The focus of today's presentation is on the ecosystem services provided by forests, but the survey that we did covered much more. So it covered also parks and trees, perceptions of ecosystem disservices, perceptions, particularly of aesthetics, by using images that had a gradient from more natural to more cultivated forests and park-like structures. And also, while we developed the questionnaire, COVID-19 hit us all, and so we also included parts on that as well. And last but not least, also some expectations that people might have on the infrastructure to be found in forests and parks. Now, where did we collect data? As I said, it's a China-EU collaboration and research project. So we did it in China, collected there 7,379 responses from, let's say, the general public, from the people. And in Europe, it's resulted in 13,319 responses across 33 countries. I put or visualized it here on the map for everyone, but I think there's not so much more to say. So let's go straight to the results. As I said, these are preliminary results. So we have to, we can use them as an indication, but perhaps not as the final end product. Okay, so the first one on the societal perceptions towards forest ecosystem services in Europe. These are the results in response to the question, how important are the following benefits of this forest to you? This question was in response to, or in reference to a specific forest that the respondents also located on a map. So these map locations will be used for further analysis later on. We didn't use a typical 7-point Likert scale, but a slider from 0, not important, to 100, very much important. And in this case, it refers to really just forests in the countryside, let's say. And here I'm presenting the results for the 3,379 responses that we got. I used the median, so the middle value to rank these in importance. But I'm also presenting you the interquartile range, which is a measure of statistical dispersion, and it always contains 50% of the data. So what can we see? Well, the 4 most important FES are habitats for plants and animals, aesthetics, air quality, and human health, based on this ranking. And since the IQR is rather small, it means that the answers are also rather similar. So many people answered or ranked these very high across this data set. Then on the other hand, we have the least important, where in our study employment, fuel wood, wood for timber and hunting. And there you can see this IQR, it's a bit larger. So it indicates that that the answers are not so coherent. So perhaps they differ a little bit regionally or across different age groups and so on. Okay, moving on. I would like to show some, or based on the 3 different groups, provisioning, regulating, and cultural FES, some comparisons by countries. We can see that for wood for timber, it's most important based on the median in Turkey, in Hungary, and also in the Scandinavian countries. For fuel wood, there's also differences. It ranks rather high in Poland, in Hungary, and in Norway. And also for hunting, we can see that this ranks rather high in Turkey, Sweden, and Hungary, but also Norway. Interestingly, non-timber products, well, they are least important, it appears, in countries like Belgium or the UK, but rather important in Eastern Europe and Russia. Now coming to the regulating FES, we can see that water and soil protection is rather important in Turkey and Romania, air quality very much in Southern Europe. We have carbon storage, that's particularly important. It appears in Eastern Europe as well as Russia. And for temperature reduction, we can see in Europe a bit of a gradient from north to south. So the more south you go, the more important it becomes. Now the cultural FES, I think it's worth pointing out that there's also a bit of a divide there, that in Eastern Europe, this seems to be rather important. For education, one country that strikes out is perhaps Spain, but also Romania and Hungary. And for recreation, we can see that Russia and Hungary also score very high on this. Yeah, perhaps. Okay. Then on the aesthetics, I think it's again a bit of a gradient this time from west to east, that this increases also towards more Eastern Europe. I also would like to present some results on the differences between the rural forest, so the results that we just saw for all the countries, with responses that we got for urban forests. I think what appears here is that when you look at the center there, at temperature reduction, that there is temperature reduction, spiritual value, and recreation, that these are more important and rank higher in urban forests than they do on rural forests. So moving on, I also have here a comparison by gender, so between female and male, and this line there on the screen indicates a little bit that all the regulating and cultural forest ecosystem services that are on the left part of this plot is where females rank higher than male. Whereas for the provisioning ecosystem services, the males rank this more important than females. Last but not least, I also have this comparison by place of residence. So whether a respondent really lives in the city center of, let's say, Hamburg, or in the rural countryside of the Black Forest. And we can see that the biggest difference there is that residents in the city rate temperature reduction and recreation much higher or higher than people in the countryside. Okay, in summary, I think what I can say is that we observed higher demand for regulating and cultural FES than for provisioning FES by the general public, so to say. There's little variety in the demand across cultural and regulating FES, as many are rated as very important. I think more analysis when comparing for age, environmental orientation, or basic human values, which will still follow, should give more insight into this data. And last, another point that I think we saw, even it was rather brief, is that the FES or the demand towards FES is regionally diverse within Europe. And last but not least, we observe differences between the type of forest, gender, places of residence, but at this first sight, they don't appear very strong yet, and they mainly concern basically the provisioning FES. Yeah. I said already that more analysis will follow, and this was rather an appetizer. Yeah, so I think that's it then from my side to get you started on the discussion. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dennis Voigt from the EFI, for actually bringing in even another project into the game and telling us some interesting insights on this demand side for ecosystem services as far as the forest is concerned. Now, let's turn to our panel, as we've said, and let's start with Paula Guimaraes, so from the Navigator company. Now, if I look at those figures that Dennis just presented, then I see that most, indeed, as he also mentioned at the end, most of those ecosystem services, first ecosystem services that have to do directly with business, are in the lower part of the spectrum. Even the provision of employment, but the timber, fuel are much lower than what we see as cultural, aesthetic, and other and health related first ecosystem service. Does that worry you? Isn't that not a reason for a little bit of worry on your side?
Thank you, Mark, and thank you for the initiative. And glad to be here and be able to draw some comments. Yes, we could say it's worrying, but I also have to say it's not surprising. I was wondering, I'm not sure if Dennis pointed it out, but I'm not sure exactly how the questionnaire was put before the people who are answering. And I'm saying this because many times the provisioning services are not completely recognized as ecosystem services. There's a tendency that some people acknowledge ecosystem services in a more, so to say, romantic way. They look at the regulation, the cultural, the aesthetics, but never as provisioning. So that would be probably one of the reasons behind this. But also, I'm not sure if everybody's aware also of the demands and the challenges that we as human beings and as economic actors or people needing businesses will also depend on forests and these provisioning services to fulfill our activities, our needs, but also to counter climate change and so on, because of course, nature and climate are only two sides of the same coin when we think about tackling climate change and looking for a more responsible use of resources. So I think there's a lot of acknowledgement of all these variables in the same equation that probably a regular citizen does not yet put on the table. So that would be, I guess, one of the reasons. But yes, it's amazing how this comes in line with an opinion that I already had when talking to people about what these ecosystem services are when we talk about or look at forests. So not surprising. But just to say, congratulations for the comprehensiveness of your project. Very, very interesting. Yeah. Thank you.
Certainly, Dennis will like to hear that. So that's very nice of you. Thank you. And Paula, you indeed talked about this, this romantic idea, and on the practical side, the provisioning services, they are being perhaps not always understood even as being part of the picture, which is, I think, quite an important point. We might come back to that one later on. Before I go to Vaško next, I'd like to actually ask our participants. So if you have a statement to make, if you would like to react to something that you hear here, do make a sign. My colleague Katarina notice it and will notice it also in the chat. So then we will turn to you as well in a moment. But before we do that, we go over to Vaško Ferreira Costa, European Investment Bank. Vaško, so there is, on the one hand, this perhaps surprising result or not so surprising result about more of a romantic idea about the forest, but there's also the diversity that Dennis talked about, the diversity within Europe. Do you see this coming back in the kind of projects that you're financing from the EIB side?
Good afternoon, and thank you for the invitation, and congratulations for all the work and the good presentations and results. Indeed, we are on our projects, and what you are seeing in the market is that nature is coming back throughout our projects, and we are pushing to have more nature in our projects. And what we see is that nature, in this case, let's mention forest because it's what we're talking about, can provide resilient and less costly solutions to the traditional problems that we have. And I'm talking particularly in cities, and it was mentioned in the statistics, in the opinions that lower the temperature in cities, adapting to climate change, using nature, it's probably one of the less costly solutions for to do that. And sometimes the people don't have that perception, but it has to be driven somehow by the public authorities that have the role to think through the climate adaptation plans and to make the trade-off and the cost-benefit analysis of introducing nature across the projects. And this is something that we are indeed seeing, and but the comprehension and understanding of that cost-benefit is not yet there, at least on, let's say, it's not generic. There are a number of forward-looking actors that have that information and have the teams to reach the conclusions, those conclusions, but for time being is not a generic, let's say, understanding.
Okay, thank you very much, Vasco. And then let's turn to our colleague Alice Bunyuk from the European Landowners Association. So you, as landowners, your members are confronted with all these, maybe at least multiple demands that we can see in terms of forest ecosystem services, sometimes conflicting demands. Now, how do you deal with that, Alice? Are you there with us? Alice, are you there? If we can't hear you. You cannot start your micro nor video. That's not good. So there we need to work on this. My colleague is on it in the background to see if we can help you. I think now I heard something. Yes, there you are, Alice.
Good afternoon, everybody. Many thanks for the invite. As a representative of landowners and forest owners, we are very happy to be part of some EU projects. I mentioned it in the chat. We had some similar results, and I joined the previous comment on the romantic aspect. I would like to also add that citizens and administration is taking for granted that these ecosystem services are provided as side production of raw material. We are providing ecosystem services since ages for free. We are good actors and we can adapt to the demand, but the demand need to be precise and not everything in the meantime. And the demand, you have demand which is conflicting, various demands which are completely different. So it's important to clarify that, to have the adaptation by the producers. On the other hand, the legislative framework needs to be adapted for this production to help the producer to provide the ecosystem services. And it's important to have discussion and to have the agreement of the forest owners for that. Another aspect is the time frame. We are working on decades, centuries, and the citizens are thinking and the administration are thinking on a shorter term. If you want something, you need to think about it 50 years or 100 years ago. So this is not a rapid production. Nature needs time, and the managers need to be in a position to manage the areas. Right now, we are very, very anxious about what is going on at the European level with the biodiversity strategy, namely the strict protection areas, which is a drama because it's a ban of any activity there. So we are working closely with the Commission to express the views of the forest owners and to be in a position to increase the production of ecosystem services while producing raw material.
Okay, thank you very much. Thank you. Is it Marie-Alice or is it just Elise?
Marie-Alice, but it's okay with that.
Marie-Alice, okay, Marie-Alice, thank you very much for these first words as a reaction to what we've heard. Nature takes its time, and the very strict protection that, as you said, might cause you quite some problems and your members in actually adjusting to all these conflicting, sometimes at least multiple demands that we've heard about. Now, let me turn to my colleague Katharina. What's happening in the chat, and what are participants saying about what we've heard?
Thank you, Mark. Yes, we've already seen the first comment in the chat from Jens Albetrup, which was actually a question to Dennis, and Dennis already answered. So there's a lot of activity in the chat, but maybe just for everybody that didn't have a look, the question was the assessment of the importance related to specific forest close to the residence of the people? And maybe Jens, as you put your hand up, is there more that you would like to follow up with?
Yeah, actually, I wonder this could maybe explain why the provisioning service is less valued. That I don't care if we cannot get the timber from this specific forest, because there's plenty of other forests around. But I use this forest that is close to where I live for recreation and aesthetic purposes. So this actually could explain the surprise we got in the beginning, was said by Mark.
Yeah, great. No, thank you. Dennis, I mean, you put your response in there to the question that the closeness varies in the case, but is there more maybe that you would like to highlight, or if there is a real relationship between the closeness and the valuation of it? Dennis.
Well, I don't think I can say much more other than what I put in the chat. Like we made some early assessments now, and it looks like that, as I wrote there, that it's usually for the majority of people less than 20 minutes travel time. But what more or other, there's lots of other interesting questions that we still have also from this data set, but we are not there yet with the analysis, so I cannot say much more at this point.
Okay, thank you. So we're all very interested to find out what else is coming out of the data set. At the moment, that's all the question mark from the chat. But of course, if there's more that you want to ask to Dennis, please do let us know.
Yeah, thank you very much. And it's Katharina, just to follow up on that. Dennis, would you say, or can you say on the basis of the data that you have, that there is rising demand for forest ecosystem service, or was that not really covered?
So I cannot say this because we looked at a particular time and you know, if we did this maybe in 3 years again, then maybe we can say something about that, but at this point, no.
Okay, now thank you very much. So what we can really take from this is that there is, demand for very different services, forest ecosystem services, and that actually this is certainly multiple, with the kind of provisioning services being more towards the lower side of things. And that is seen also what we heard from our panelists, it's sometimes a bit conflicting, and perhaps, what they say, they see a little bit of a romanticized idea there. But we have more people who want to say something. I see, Katharina.
Yes, indeed. There was a raise of hands, and I would suggest that we just go in order of the moment the hands were raised. So that's Georg first. Georg, what's your question or comment?
It's more a comment. I think yesterday, was it Marco or myself? I forgot. I think perhaps we didn't present it from the forest managers and forest owners survey. One of the questions we asked to this 1,800, I believe, European forest owners and managers is if they perceive a rising or decreasing demand for ecosystem services. And at least in their perspective, it was quite clear that there is a rising demand for ecosystem services perceived by them. And it's the least rising, interestingly, if I recall it now correctly, relating to the provisioning service, but also rising. But the most rising, I believe, in regards to regulating services, which is things like biodiversity, climate mitigation function. So this is in their perspective of that collective, it is rising. But again, it's a one shot at one point asking about their current perception. Thank you.
Yeah, no, thank you very much. And also there is a comment from Marie Alice in the chat that there is an increase in visitors, at least also in one of the cases recorded. Jens, you had another comment or question.
Yeah, I was just actually wondering, when you presented as a study of the demand for ecosystem services, and when I come from an economic department, I would ask, why didn't you do an economic valuation study where you actually estimate the preferences, where you actually see what are people willing to pay? Because then you could maybe force people to really show the preferences, because they have to give something up for having. Why didn't you do an environmental economic valuation study?
Okay, so that's a question to Dennis. Was there a particular reason for not doing an economic valuation study? Or
I think you can always do more. That's for sure. And I remember that this at one point came up, but we decided that this is also very difficult to measure. And in the end, we thought that it's simply more interesting to find more or find out more about the COVID-19 visitor patterns. And so this in the end wasn't included.
Thank
and
you.
As Georg points out, yes, we're social scientists, not economists. Very good.
It's always a good, of course, a good argument to stick with where your strengths are. So very good. Thank you. Lisa, a question or comment from your side?
Yes, thank you. I'd like to comment on if there's a rising demand for cultural ecosystem service and provision services. So definitely for cultural ecosystem services, and pandemic has boosted this demand very much in North Europe and in many other countries. We have got rather many studies conducted. In Finland, we found 23% of increased visitation in national parks, and also we conducted a national outdoor recreation demand inventory for 2 years, and we saw that pandemic changed the attitudes towards nature. We had a specific survey to people, and particular women reported more than men. 60% of women reported, it's national data, that their appreciation towards nature and the offers from nature, health and well-being, recreation, this type of benefits have increased. And also another study pointed out exactly the same, run by Finnish independence fund Sitra, that really the pandemic has stopped people, and nature was one of the critical tools to help through this pandemic time. So and it's expectation that this kind of it has changed the attitudes, at least for some people, partially permanently.
No.
Katarina, in a moment we'll have to move on, although this is a fascinating discussion. I believe there's still some short, perhaps, contributions there?
Yes, I still have 2 hands raised. And as Mark said, would ask for a short comment or question. First, floor to Harald.
Yes, thank you very much. The title of this presentation was Demand for Ecosystem Services, and one way to learn about demand is to ask people, what do you want? Another way is to look what people do by their daily purchasing decisions when they act as consumers. And there we see wood-based products are in high and in growing demand. In the first lockdown in the pandemic, toilet paper ran out in some European countries. Protection gear for the COVID pandemic is made from wood fibers. We see a rising demand on building with wood. Wood is a scarce raw material in the construction sector at the moment. So what we see is a discrepancy between expression definition of demand by asking people and when they act as consumers, when they pay real money. In the morning session, there was this Croatian example where the boxes for voluntary contributions were destroyed and only very, very few euros were put into that. So I think policy has to deal with this discrepancy and not only rely on questionnaires, but also on the daily decisions that the people do as consumers, and they express a clear preference for wood-based products. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dennis, before just maybe a final reaction from you, there's also a hand raised by Helga.
Yeah, I would like to turn the page back from what Harald said, despite the fact that I totally agree with what he said. I would just a small comment because we were concerned. How can it be that citizens do not prefer provisioning services when they're asked about their perception of forest ecosystem services? And we did a little study in the city of Vienna with school students aged 12 to 18. And interestingly, we found education matters for forest, because students in secondary schools, close to finishing the school, so to say, they prefer provisioning services, maybe also because they expect to find jobs in the forest sector, while the higher the education goes, the more interest is in regulating and cultural services. But again, we would have to do this study, replicate it elsewhere, whether this is not something specific to Vienna, where a lot of forest is around, or whether this is also valid in other cities.
Thank you so much, Helga. Dennis, any final reactions from your side on those points?
No, I think especially what Harald said is an interesting point. But other than that, I don't have any other comments at this point. I would like to thank you all for listening, and yeah, perhaps some of you thought it's interesting. I think from the discussion, I think there's definitely some, and then yeah, please stay tuned. There's definitely more to come out of this questionnaire.
Thank you so much.
We'll definitely stay tuned. Thank you very much for this, Dennis, and for the reactions we also got. So there was, Harald's last comment. Are people here in those surveys having their words where their money is, gets us to the next topic, which is the income streams for FES, Katharina.
Yes, indeed. We have our second impulse presentation. This one to be held by Sven Wunder, who is principal scientist for or at the Mediterranean facility of the European Forest Institute, so FEMET. There he leads the research activities on payment for environmental services and other incentives and new business models for enhancing the provision of ecosystem services. And we're very much interested to hear more from that experience, especially on the income stream. So Sven.
So thank you very much, Katharina. Yes, next slide, please. I think when looking at income streams from forest environmental services, we have to be clear about what is it that we want to look at. It could be first, narrowly looking at what are the incomes generated in payments for environmental services schemes. And I will look at this and know quite a lot about that side of it. But we could then broaden it and also say, what are the flows of income from other regulatory environmental services and cultural services in a broader sense. And as I said yesterday, that's what I consider sort of the true services in these Millennium Ecosystem Assessment categories. The third would be, to also include those provisioning services, timber, non-timber forest products, and basically look at any forest income whatsoever. In this presentation, I will look at the first of these groups, including in the Global South, where I've worked a lot. I will also look a bit at two. I will not include, though, the fake services under 3. And now I just learned that this is a romantic way of seeing things, as Paula said, but I'm happy to assume that label, basically because I think it's a whole different kettle of fish, how functionally these products are being produced. And along the way, we also need to look at whose incomes. It's not always only landowners, and it's also gross and net incomes. They're different, slightly academic aspects, but nevertheless important for the practical outcome also. Next, please. And this slide just from yesterday, just to remind us that, of these PES schemes, by far most of them are on forests and even more on trees as such. So we can very much use PES and FES as synonyms, as I will do a bit in the next, in what follows. Next, please. Seems to have difficulty. There it is. So just conceptually for us to think about, how do stakeholders get into payment arrangements for environmental services? We have landowners there. We have those who are the environmental service users, and we have people who are not participating. And on the landowner side in particular, it's interesting to look at the number of filters. Are these people eligible in the first place, according to the criteria that have been set? Do they wish to participate? Are they able to, in terms of their endowments available? And would they be sort of competitive providers? And those things determine which people are in and which people are out. Next one, please. And once we have determined, who's in and out, there's some negotiation processes, and some payments are changing hands, and there will be some opportunity costs, some things you forego by entering the PES schemes. There may also be some non-income effects, and there will also be some effects of that PES scheme on those people who are not participating. So next, please. This just to finish off the conceptual part. Now let's look a bit at the empirical evidence. First, here from the global south, you have spending shares that are basically all over the place, right? In Costa Rica, for instance, ranging from 10% and in some cases, in some poor areas, to even 44% of monetary household incomes. That's a lot, but that's because these people are very poor and they're fixed rates being applied, right? Also in Ecuador, in some very poor areas, actually, the PES income was like 1/3 almost of their total income. There are also some sometimes assets being generated, such as plantations that will then have a rate of return over a certain time period. And there may be some other positive side effects, like you make a contract and your land tenure security is enhanced. Your community organization improves. You make yourself visible to new business contacts or new donors, etc. The evidence in general from the global south is often, there's positive extra income, but not a lot. But in poor areas, this can be larger because then you get a large rent, you get much more than your costs of provision. In the C4 Poverty and Environment Network, we also gathered information on the PES related and ES related incomes, and it came up just as a result of 0.36% of their forest income. So it's tiny, and that is because probably, we were in areas quite deep in forest with large forest cover. We did not have areas with large tourism incomes, for instance. So in those 34 sites we looked at, it was just simply not a factor beyond the very marginal. Next, please. I think a factor to think about is also the environmental service users. And I was working on this pest scheme in the Andes of Colombia. And there you had like 15 upstream farmers that were the service providers, and you had 2,500 downstream water users. And those, concerned with the, income effects and welfare, all sort of studying the 15 upstream farmers. But what about, the people that are downstream, and also those people that are poor and in need of improved services? Their health status, their safe spendings on buying water, etc. Those are also income flows, obviously, that can and maybe should, to a higher degree, be quantified. So let's not get over-focused also on landowner incomes in terms of the welfare assessment. Next, please. There are also a number of effects, possibly on non-participants that work via input and output markets. And those will depend on, what a pest scheme does. Does it restrict activities? For instance, in terms of setting aside forests that would otherwise have been turned into agriculture and timber extraction and things that create economic activities? Or on the contrary, do they stimulate tree planting and agricultural terraces or whatever, things that create added activity? Then the sort of the non-participants may benefit through multiplier effects. If it's activity restricting, they may suffer a cost. So those impacts, indirect impacts, will be quite casuistic. Next, please. So looking at landowner welfare impacts, this is basically in the global south and including China, various of those, looking at both at assets and incomes and expenditure, whatever has been measured. You can see that the impact sizes in a rigorously evaluated manner. You can see, most of them are positive. Some of them are insignificant and maybe even negative, but there's quite some variation in the effects. Next, please.
Sven, you have just a little bit more than a minute left.
Yes, that's fine. This is what Marco Lovic showed yesterday from the Sincere InnoForest project. It's just some of the income shares that people self-reported. And there you can see, as we could expect, the dominance of the provisioning environmental services, but in my view, surprisingly high share of regulating environmental services in Europe, as I think the average may be something like 25% or so, which is considerable, and a somewhat smaller share for cultural environmental services. Next, please. Last slide. Some takeaway messages. So I think the low amount of forest pest schemes also limits how much income can be made through payments for environmental services. And actually, I had one slide on the European forest-based pest schemes, which for some reason has been, but take my word for it that there are not a lot of these schemes out there. And second, that still the European landowners seem to self-report a non-trivial share of incomes coming from at least the regulating forest environmental services. If we look at PES as policies, because often they are being conducted also by the public sector, we should notice that many of them are from the start being carried out on double purposes, both the environment and generating welfare. And in a European setting, as we know from the CAP and other things, often the welfare part is actually quite important, if not dominant. Opportunity costs, are a bit of a dark horse in the picture. What do people give up in order to participate? It's typically less than what they're getting out of it, but we don't know exactly how large the difference is in terms of the net welfare gains in the end. And the last observation here is if you give higher payments for environmental services, if you raise kind of the compensation or the rewards, you can increase, some of these informational rents, and that will generate more welfare on behalf of the participating landowners. But it will obviously also be more costly and diminish the environmental cost efficiency of those schemes. So these are sort of the natural policy trade-offs, and as you can see, there's some unknown variables in the picture that we need to take into account. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Sven. I know this complicated and complex subject, and it's difficult to present it all in the limited time we have, and also for our discussion we have to be limited. But let me start again with our panel and with Marie-Alice and then with Paula first, perhaps. So what Sven talked about was, on the one hand, like, income streams for whom, and this kind of wider picture of income streams, not just for landowners or for companies, but actually for quite a large group of society that we have to take into account. And then one interesting second aspect that I pick out, but you might pick out further and others, is that there are actually right now, seemingly from that survey that you mentioned, Sven, and that has already been presented yesterday in parts, is that there are quite significant income streams apparently already, not from this direct provision in services, but from the regulating one, and perhaps even to a smaller extent also from the cultural one. Maybe we can have a short reaction from you, starting with Marie-Alice.
Yes, do you hear me?
Your Zoom link works, yes.
Right now, no. Limited income comes from ecosystem services. It's really marginal.
Okay.
So this is problematic because the service is provided, but the money is not coming. The constraints is there. You have an additional constraint, which is Natura 2000 areas, where you have a lot of restrictions and constraints. So it's an additional factor of difficulty compared to other areas. And we were pushing for the use of the Natura 2000 logo for at least have a chance to show that the product is comes from area with additional constraints. Up till now, it was not possible. Nature directives dates from 92, so we are in 2021. Good news. We have a positive move from the Commission. Now there is a possibility to use the Natura 2000 logo. I still have to dig in what is inside in the because the devil is in the details, but it was not even a question of money. It was just a question of putting the logo. It was difficult. When I was thinking about time frame at one stage, so it's important. The profitability is low and is on series of years. So if there is a blocking factor in between, you lose a lot as a forest owner. So it's really important to take care of that. If you change all the time the rules, it's not possible. It's a loss of money because you put human resource on it. So it's important to speak with the doers and to express clearly what the demand is. And you cannot 1 year say, oh, here is a ban of hunting because hunting is bad. Hunting is good because you have less wildlife attacking the trees, for instance, and it's good for the local economy. There are plenty of elements, so it's having an attitude black or white. It's completely ridiculous and detrimental to economy, sustainable jobs locally, and for the biodiversity. If you push, for instance,
we need to move on. Thank you very much, Marie-Alice. We'll come back to you, of course, later. But Paula, then, if I can give the floor to you, do you see? I mean, what's your reaction to what Sven presented, and in the sense of, do you see actually a competition in the regulating services from your side, from the provisioning side? Is that something you see happening?
Okay. Well, yes, some competition. Yes, mainly. Radicated on what I was saying about what typically is assumed as ecosystem services and this provision versus the other ecosystem services when there shouldn't be a versus. So, and picking up on what Marie-Alice was saying, I think that what is lacking here and the results that Sven just presented are very good to sustain my opinion about this, is that we need to have a systemic approach on ecosystem services and look at this, first of all, a little bit on a landscape level, because in some landscapes you don't have, you cannot look at a forest area of a one landowner and do a study, because you have countries where you have small to very small landowners, and it's the whole landowners either having forests or other land use types that contribute to the ecosystem services because they don't have boundaries, physical boundaries. So yes, we should look at this in a systemic way and look at provision and other ecosystem services together, because there are actually opportunity costs, as Sven pointed out, and this should also be taken into account, especially when you move into joint or aggregated land use management systems. And I was thinking, for instance, in some certification schemes, as forest certification schemes, when you have small landowners and you need to ensure that you have production forests, but also you need to have conservation areas and so on, there will always be opportunity costs for the landowners who are the owners of the water streams, the cultural sites, etc. So this shows that you really need to have a systemic approach. You really need to look at all the ecosystem services together, take into account the opportunity costs, the investment, and also value what you can take out of as provision services, because that also provides not only the goods and raw materials from the forests, but also a lot of jobs that facilitate the investment on the other ecosystem services. So
thank you.
There
very
shouldn't
much.
be competition. It's all together.
It's all together. It's a systemic approach, as we were saying, Paula. And let me quickly move to Vasco. Vasco, you're a bank on the one hand, but you're also a public bank, right? So how is your view on these income streams? You know, this breadth actually of income in many different ways. If you look at what income is, as Sven pointed out, what's your view on it? Are you focusing on the provisioning and the regulating? What about the rest? What about the cultural ones? Does that play a role from your side, and should it?
Yes, I very much agree with what has been said by Paula and Steven. And the results, what we are seeing, it's basically the ecosystem service represents really a marginal part of the income stream of the projects that we are, let's say, analyzing most of the times. And because the ecosystem service is part of an ecosystem, economic ecosystem as well. So what we do is that usually we don't look at the ecosystem services per se. It should, in terms of economic value, only on that angle. We look that within a context of a broader project, and we try to value that. And then currently the way to value that, there are not many indeed. What we have seen for the time being, indeed, is some payment for ecosystems credits from the FSC certification that can be integrated in terms of value. There's a carbon sequestration. There is also some type of let's say benefits or externalities that for the time being are not really valued as well. But what we're pushing, it's to have our counterparties to go broader, because most of our counterparts, as mentioned Paula, most of these subjects has to be tackled in a landscape way, in a broader way when we work with large counterparties, and they have the power in reality to value these ecosystem services and to put the value on it, because most of the time represents just a small portion of the income stream, but it's important, let's say, footprint for developing business cases. And we have examples that we had done under the natural capital financing facility in Belgium, for example, where we have financed 150 million water company in Belgium. And within that 150 million loan, 5 million were allocated only for the ecosystem service. What they did is they did a study around the ecosystems they are using in reality, and they tried to compensate the people that were contributing to the health of those ecosystems. In this case, was farmers as well, and they value that, and we have basically helped them to put in place all the methodologies and the financing as well. So it's just to mention that it's really most of the times a minor income stream, but is an important footprint either from the strategy perspective for the companies, either for the establishing business case that you can further develop. But for the time being, it's only part of the economic ecosystem.
Okay, thank you very much, Vasco. Katarina, I believe there are many comments and to see the numbers of people that have contributed there in the chat. We only have 7 minutes, Katarina, for some reactions from participants.
Yeah, no, thank you very much, Mark. There has been some activity indeed in the chat, mainly around self-reported values. And that those self-reported values could be perhaps public subsidies for environmental actions, where in some countries that might not even be so trivial. So, and then around that point, there was a bit of a discussion between Bo and Sven as well on there, that also cultural, that the borderline between cultural and NTFPs can be blurred. So if you don't pay for the right to do horseback riding in the forest or the service of an NTFP. Yeah, I think there is a bit of a conversation, a side conversation going on there as a reaction to what the panel and the presenter have been discussing.
Okay. Thank you very much. Then if there are no people who have directly indicated to you that they would like to come into this discussion, then let's move on, because we're actually looking at very different aspects of this issue about the business side here of forest ecosystem service and payment for forest ecosystem services. And let's move to one of the areas which sometimes is overlooked. And I think it's great that we're not doing this here. Yeah?
Maria-Liz would like to talk, I think.
Okay, can't see that here right now. So Maria-Liz, yeah, we are a bit, stressed in terms of time, but for a short comment, Maria-Liz, please go ahead.
I put 2 elements in the chat: conservation easements, and I advise you to read the recommendation of the project Land is Forever Life. And second point, right now we are afraid of the strict protection areas, again a top-down approach with blunt band of activities. Forestry as extractive. We are not destroying nature, we are working with nature. And if you put us in a exceptional process, we will not be in a position to provide ecosystem services. So forest is an active process, a dynamic process. So Please keep that in mind.
Okay, thank you very much, Marie-Lise, for this clarification. Moving to the question of financing for ecosystem services. As I said, an issue that is sometimes overlooked, not here, and we have an impulse, don't we, Katarina?
Yes, absolutely. We actually have Bo Jellesmark Thorsen, who just alerted us already that there is another comment, so very much on the game here. Bo is a professor of applied economics at the University of Copenhagen, where he's researching new ways of regulating the supply of ecosystem services from forests. So on the spot there to tell us more about financing for forest ecosystem services. Bo, if you want to share your screen with the presentation.
Coming up, I hope.
Yes, we already see it.
Yeah.
Nicely.
And then going into presentation mode, I'll just have to pick a few clicks here to like that.
Still yeah, now we're there. Perfect.
Yeah, there's a little bit of loading time, as we can see also on Sven's slides. Yeah. So thank you for this. I have like 10 minutes, so I'll be quick here. Some of you will recognize some of the slides from earlier talks by me, because I'm gonna go to this in a rather general way. It also means that apart from drawing on results from Sincere, I'll draw on earlier results from other projects that we have been working in over the years on the same issues. And today, because yesterday and today, I can see in the chat that carbon as a new potential sellable service get some attention. I want to add a few comments at the end of this talk on this activity, carbon sequestration as a financing source in forestry, because it's getting a lot of traction, or at least getting a lot of interest, and could get a lot of traction. And also in Denmark, there's been development where I want to share some of the discussion about how is that a good thing and how might it actually be a bad thing. And the last thing, I think, is probably what will cause some discussion here. But first, overall, we're looking at this landscape just very simplified. We have the forest, we have the regulating authorities that regulate today how forest management and forest owners' decision rights are aligned vis-a-vis the entire society, so the rest of us, so to say. We have the landowners, the forest owners. We have mediating agents here. We'll not talk much about them, but those are agents that make things happen on the ground, like forest entrepreneurs and so on. Then we have funding agents, and that's what we will talk about mostly today, who are actually paying for things happening in the forest when it comes to ecosystem services. So first thing to notice is across the EU and across the kind of results that Marco Lovritz showed us yesterday, that also Sven referred to today, it's important to know that regulation varies a lot in the EU, and that will be factored into any options for financing the use of the land in the forest. That will be influenced by the EU regulation, of course, but certainly also by national regulations and habits, essentially. So Liviu from Romania has done some work with colleagues there. A lot of us have been involved in it, that document these major differences and how they matter for key rights over access to, for instance, non-timber forest products and recreation and other things. And that again will have implications for the legal basis for the different kind of policy instruments that we could bring into play to develop or underpin markets or similar exchanges for ecosystem services. It will also have consequences for the popular support. So and political and popular support to, of course, these things are constantly changing, slowly changing when it comes to forest regulation, but changing. But new regulation and initiatives outside, essentially, of the forest policy arena, we could say, like the EU taxonomy on sustainable investments and finance, will already be driving new developments in FES financing, I suspect, and is already driving it. Climate policies also driving it. Biodiversity policies, I suspect, will also be driving it in the coming years. Several years ago, in the New Forests project, we asked people, ordinary people, citizens, and we ask forest owners who should foot the bill for providing different kinds of services. And we did that in several countries. Part of this project is 5 different countries here. And what the point of this graph basically is to say the differences in regulation and culture that we saw on the former slide comes in again in differences in the countries when we ask people who should foot the bill for providing different services. For instance, if you see the bottom graph, the Finnish citizens are much more likely to think that enhancing improvements in recreational services should be paid by the users than people in Italy or Poland are willing to. And that comes likely from different regulation. And these vary across different ecosystem services. For direct use goods, we generally find higher support for user pays, and user pays model for financing has been investigated in the Swiss case on funeral sites in Sincere, the Italian case on mushrooms, of course, and the Croatian case on donating and paying for fees for recreational exercises, recreational access. But in particular for public good types of forest ecosystem services, many people in different countries expect the government to pay in. That doesn't mean that they don't pay, but that means that they expect to pay through taxes, right? As it's the community, the society that takes over. And this is being explored, for instance, in the Danish and Belgian cases in Sincere, where that is being assumed. And then we look on instrument design to get a cost-effective supply. So on top of that, of course, users themselves vary a lot within countries, and so do forest owners. And finally, new players are entering the system, and this system and there are new potential sources of financing that were not as dominant or as emerging a role when we asked these questions as they are today, I think. So forest owners, actually, let's just acknowledge that they also likely may carry costs, willing or not, in providing ecosystem services. So forest owners may be profit motivated as a big role, and if they are that, then that will be reflected in their reactions to different instruments for FES. If they're motivated like that, maybe market-based instruments is more likely to get them in than other softer instruments. They may perceive restrictions from instruments or regulations that to imply losses for them personally that goes beyond the direct profit impact. For instance, if they perceive a loss of right of ownership or private amenity values may suffer from regulation being imposed on your right of managing and deciding over your own land. They may also derive these private amenity or they may hold altruistic values. And again, that will affect their ecosystem service provision and their willingness to expand on it and how they react to different policy instruments. So in a way, forest owners are also, or actually in a big way, forest owners are also part of the financing and funding pool. And that is what we're using in some of the innovative mechanism cases in Sincere, for instance, the reverse auction cases, but also some of the other cases essentially try to exploit these differences. So now I'll turn to something a little bit beyond that. So, and that's the societies of the social responsibility. So we see that, like Sven also indicated, the EU and national budgets are still by far the main funders of public good type FES, biodiversity protection, climate, and so on, either directly through subsidies or payments to private owners or simply through state forest ownership and management of state forest ownership that deviates from private managed forests to supply these services. So regulations as they are or as they may show up on, for instance, offsetting biodiversity or undertaking mandatory conservation easements or climate impacts compensations, eco-banking, and so on. These kind of instruments have the potential to bring in private enterprises and enhance financing. And so does developments like the EU taxonomy on sustainable investment finance, because they start setting standards for what is good activities to support in the forest sector, in the land-based sector, if private companies want to compensate for part of their environmental impact with activities in these. And this is something that we see growing. We don't know how much yet, but we'll study that. We already see funding for private foundations and firms enter into phase production, pursuing carbon sequestration projects to target improved climate profiles for the companies themselves, sometimes at company level, but increasingly also actually at product level, which is to be hugely debated, I think, in the literature as this develops. But we also see funding for biodiversity and nature restoration projects is growing and seeing private funding. So what is behind this is most likely, we think, but we'll study this in a coming project coming up that Thomas Lundhede will be leading from Copenhagen as part of the SUPERB project that EFI is coordinating. Corporate social responsibility, national philanthropy regulations, and so on likely motivate part of this funding coming in here. How far this can actually drive forest ecosystem supply, we don't know yet. We'll study this. But we already know that this is not without complications. Greenwashing is a real risk that we, as any supplier here, should be aware if they want to enter something that can be contrived as a greenwashing exercise. We also should acknowledge that there are often limits to what can drive the value of ecosystem services for private firms. Limits set by regulations and set by expectations and demands, for instance, to the additionality of the services being supplied, notably in the carbon area. Also, when we start setting up systems like the voluntary verified carbon system and the taxonomy itself, they are going to drive MRV costs. It's going to be more costly to monitor and verify that you do things according to different standards than in the current, should we say, more Klondike-like activities that we see in this sector. So I'm involved in Denmark in the government's attempt to put structure to the use of private funding for afforestation as a means to reach the climate goals in Denmark. One of the debates is there, what the private sector really would like those activities to count for as much as they can, because that would help them in achieving goals and achieving demands. The public at large is concerned that this instrument needs to be effective. So I'll show you this graph here if I have time. Otherwise, you'll let me know, Mark, right? This is the last
just
slide.
1 minute left, in fact.
This is the last slide. So what we have here is a classic instrument catalog, that we supply to the Danish government when they are to select different instruments. Every colored box here is an instrument. The orange one is an instrument called afforestation. That's a fairly low-cost instrument in terms of social cost per ton of carbon equivalent units that it provides, right? So that's why we know that if the Danish goal or the EU goal of carbon greenhouse gas reductions is to be achieved, a lot of more afforestation should be achieved. Now the question comes, who's to finance it and for what? So clearly this will be a painful measure. Even if it's fairly cheap, it will be painful for governments to do that over the annual household bill. So that's why the Danish government is asking the private sector to step in. But here's a problem. If firms start funding this afforestation and we make the agreement, or society accepts that the companies can then be exempt from doing these actions that sum to the same amount of ton, then the net effect of doing this afforestation with private funding, that they can count as accepting them from other regulatory demands, will be that we push up the amount. We need then the regional goal requires that other parts of society now will have to undertake more costly actions and carry the cost, and the net effect of the afforestation will be zero. So that's why if we want private money to get in here, we have to do it on the basis of a desire. Could be a marketing advantage, could be simply a right to do business necessity for them to do it, but they will have to do it up and above whatever else they do to meet the goals and the regulation required by the goals set by governments. If they do it, if not, then additionality is out the window. That's it.
Thank you very much, Bo, with a very interesting slide there at the end that I'm sure that Paula and Maria-Lise will have something to say about in just a moment. But let me first go to Vasco, because financing with the European Investment Bank, that's up your sleeve, that's your turf, so to say. So Bo, let us know quite a lot also about the new players entering the market with, coming from philanthropy, private foundations, and also on the regulating services. Now, how do you see that from the European Investment Bank, the danger of greenwashing also that Bo has been laying out here? How do you see that coming back in practice from your side? And what can you do about it?
Yes. This presentation was very interesting, and thank you. It's exactly what we're seeing. We have been approached by many companies and by the private sector to co-finance the projects that will basically align them with the taxonomy and the regulations. And it's with care that we look at this. I think it's a great opportunity to restore areas that don't have any business model attached to them. You have now a number of areas around Europe that are in risk of being deserted. And there is no business model attached to those areas. You cannot really plant, let's say, commercial species. So using the opportunity, it can be great to restore those areas. This is the decade of restoration, and to have ecosystem service around. But in reality, in the middle, you need to have strong governance. And that's exactly what I think the objective of we're working on in Denmark. And we on our side as well. So we try to implement and we develop over the next times is exactly models that have in the middle the regulators, as you mentioned, but also entities that can certificate, but also can say what is the additionality that has to be added to the model. And so the companies have to go through the process of having clear strategy for carbon neutrality, climate neutrality, and what is residual that cannot be mitigated, then should have value there. And I think this is part of the discussion that we're having. But we also see a great opportunity here to move together with the private sector to go into business models that most of the times are not really bankable business models, but as indeed have this governance stake very strong in the middle. Yeah.
Hey, thank you very much, Vasco. That sounds like you're picking up those signals and actually you're seeing them also in the requests that are coming to you, and that issue is playing. And that, of course, is something that I assume that that we can hear also something from Maria-Lise and from Paula about that. If I got Bo correct, and if I just say it a little bit more strongly, then there is a danger that companies might try to just get away from their, from the need to play a full part in the story by trying to financing some mechanisms that, or having co-financing for some mechanisms that they will actually force society to invest more on other fields. What's your reaction to this? Who would like to go first? Marie, please. Maria-Lise? Still there? Yes, you're there.
On greenwashing and trying to escape from regulation, it's out of control for landowners. What we can offer is real added value in terms of ecosystem services. Then if they are playing with the red line, it's the duty of the administration. And the importance is that it's a learning process. This means that they will have to pay extra for ecosystem services, the time for them to adapt their way of producing. There are some activities where you have limited progress in perspective, so it's important to be in a position to compensate. You can call it greenwashing, but there is a limit on specific industries where they cannot improve that much, and so it's a bad thing for environment. But if you can have extra plus in another sector and help forest owners, I am for it. It's really important to increase this part. The same as for quarries. The quarries are using nature and using nature to its extreme, but then they have been forced to recreate biodiversity after their work. So you have also in the building sector, you have the gray buildings, the sort of old buildings you cannot really improve, but you cannot destroy all those buildings because you need dwellings, and if you destroy those buildings, it's a waste, and so it's a negative also for environment. So it's a question of where you put the red line, and to have the means to chase the bad guys, of course. But from a landowner's perspective, it's a way to help the society. So, yep.
Okay, thank you very much, Maria-Lise and Paula. Do you share this concern that Bo expressed about this other funding that enters the forest sector, so to say? You know, because you are an established player in the field. Do you share that concern?
Well, we're an established player, but we also manage forests. We're not just users of timber or of forest-based raw materials. We actually manage forests. So we have these forest management models in place, and we are used to have business models to take into consideration all the functions and have working forests in place. But yes, that this is I think we are in a very critical moment where everything is on the table. Climate change, let's go for afforestation. Many programs coming up, like mushrooms, you know, very appealing, very sexy. Let's plant, I don't know how many million plants, and maybe we should be asking where, when, in which season of the year, who will take care of those plants, who is going to manage. Are they appropriate at the landscape level? Are the landowners involved? What are the other stakeholders at the landscape level? Are all their needs being taken into account? So I think that when Vasco was speaking about the bankable business models, I think it's a bit like this, and it's up to us as both corporate people, but also as citizens, to make sure we engage in these business models and in a good land use model, management model, because it's about land use management for all uses, for all purposes, and of course we have to take care of all the components. So once again, in a systemic way, and of course not just going into this race to net zero, or race to this or race to that, or to comply with new legislation or so. So things must be done, because this is made on the ground. This is made out of resources, out of landscapes, and people are part of the landscape. So we keep forgetting the societal part of the program and of the problem. Yeah. And I think that these business models must take everything into consideration. So I think it's about management models.
It's about management, as you said, Paula, and you also pointed out that this is perhaps a pretty critical time now, with this new demand that comes in, with this new investment, with companies struggling also to deal with the decarbonization and the targets they have in quite other other markets than the forestry market, and the forestry-related market. So they're coming into this, and as you said, the societal questions here are key. Not to forget, and if we heard from Vashkur that the EIB seems to be on it and seems to be demanding from those companies that, or at least they're co-financing much more than just on this one little box in the chart that Bo has been showing.
Exactly.
Now let's quickly move
Mark,
to
Mark, if I could just add one other detail. It's not, and we should also think not only about afforestation or restoration, but also the ones of us who are already having forests growing for provisioning ends. We should also think about good management of what is there already, which is also being carbon sink, which is also contributing to bioeconomy and the bioeconomy that is going to help us also supply raw materials which are not fossil based. So it's not only about putting new stuff on the ground, it's also managing well what you have in there and taking into account this and taking into account as good as far as good as the others, the ones which are growing and sequestrating carbon and also contributing with more than that to a more circular
Thank you very much,
economy.
Paula. Thank you very much. Let me quickly move to Katarina. If there is anything in the chat or a few statements, we don't have much time, but if you can give me something in 5 minutes, and to all of us, in fact.
Now that's actually, it was a very interesting discussion going on, or is still going on in the chat, because the question was, or the assumption was there's really nobody paying for ecosystem services per se. For other things, yes, but not for that. And then we found a couple of collections of examples where this might actually happen, or at least where you can consider that there is this payment happening. And it's an interesting collection of examples. I invite you to have a look at the chat. There's also relations to a new report from the ecosystem marketplace, for example, but of course also to the Sincere project, where similar things were trying to be done. So do have a look. There was an interesting excursion, actually a very saddening excursion to the Italian situation at the moment, where there is a, like Georg called it, a new black deal in Italy, actually putting billions of euro to reducing taxation on gas and fossil energy. So going the opposite way compared to many of the other countries. So there is quite some interesting back and forth, I would say, between our participants in the chat. And I could imagine that there is a reaction from Bo, who is a very interesting and very active contributor to this discussion. So Bo, you have your hand up.
Yeah, that's because I know that last slide was critical. And I think actually Paula and Vasco points to some important issues about, okay, one thing is we also have to be concerned about the social and ecological context that these things happen into. That's also part of the taxonomy's sustainability and the do no significant harm principles and so on. So that's important points to include. I just want to say that, yeah, that was a critical slide, because there's an obvious trap that could be devastating essentially for the development of this. But that said, I actually think that even there's also no reason to be naive. Companies will lobby for these credits to count for as much as possible, because then it's more worth to them. Forest owners also have an interest in lobbying for that. Society has an interest in lobbying for the right regulation, in working for the right regulation. So that's what I'm pointing to. But I think even with the softer marketing gains and CSR gains and standard gains for the private sector, that will still drive quite a lot of funding. If those models that I'm sure we will see develop for this are bankable in Vasco's sense, I cannot tell you, but maybe he can. But just to say that I don't want to be more critical than that. This funding will be coming is just a question of this funding being managed and implemented in a sound way.
In a sound way, in a smart way, smart funding, so to say, that it doesn't destroy elsewhere something which it's while trying to solve a piece of the puzzle, making other pieces of the puzzle more difficult to achieve. So that's going to be quite important. Vashti, you have a very quick reaction, I see, and then we're going to move to our final topic. Vashko?
Yes. Very quickly, just to mention that from the financing perspective, I think it's a great moment to use the taxonomy and the Paris alignment agendas to go into models that have to be bankable, but that bankable means that can finance, can gather the financing necessary, and the risking also. One thing that we usually use is a blended finance, meaning that having different sources of funding that can combine together to make the business models happen. And I think it takes a bit of time to put the different actors around the table. And I'm particularly interested as well on the landowners association, that one of the things that we usually mention is that size is always small for banking institutions, and maybe from the institution of landowners association, there's something to do to try to figure out how to be, let's say, ambitious in terms of size, in terms of the organization, in terms of putting together probably a number of landowners and to create a structure that can be bankable, let's say, from let's say institutions like us or any others. What I mean is that I think it's a great moment to continue with this agenda and the talks and try to figure out what would work. But we on the IB side, we are for sure on this agenda.
Okay, thank you very much, Vasco and Maria-Alice. You might want to reflect on this and come back after the next presentation, because it tries also to bring things a little bit together. And it is about the successful FES business models, Katharina.
Yes, and we actually now have a dual presentation. We have the two colleagues joining us for this presentation, and the last impulse presentation of the day. On the one hand, we have Nelson Grima from the International Union of Forest Research Organizations, and he will be joined by Giorgia Botaro from the University of Padua. I am not sure who of the two will start, but if one of them could start their presentation.
Yes, I will start sharing the screen. Let's see.
Very good. Thank you, Giorgia.
Great, Giorgia. And please keep in the 10 minutes framework. That's really important.
It's working, right?
Yes, it does.
Super. So good afternoon to everyone. And yes, with Nelson, we are going to present to you the outcome of a joint study that we did between the Nobel Project and Sincere Project. And these outcomes comprise information about the more suitable business model to successfully provide forest ecosystem services. In 2 days, for sure, we have understand the aims of the two topics, but just a brief slide to remind the two projects. So the Sincere Project, Horizon 2020, aiming to analyze and develop policy and business model to support the provision and the enhancement of ecosystem services. Aim that is close and similar to the Nobel one, that aim to analyze the future role of forest ecosystem services and develop strategy able to support them provision. So we made a joint study aimed to determine which are those factors that drive the successful outcome in those projects aimed to provide forest ecosystem services and to boost them vision. And to have more comprehensive view, we analyze a database that we built, merging together the 3 different databases coming from the 2 projects. So we have a first database from the Sincere Project, gathering those innovative mechanisms implemented around Europe to sustain the provision and the enhancement of forest ecosystem services, and 2 others different databases from the Nobel Project, gathering mainly payment for ecosystem services. So we have analyzed this merged database, and now I give the floor to Nelson, that is going to illustrate the outcomes of this study, more specifically related to the findings about the business model. Please, Nelson.
Thank you, Georgia. I want to mention that the 161 cases that Georgia has mentioned were PES cases or PES-like cases. And we gathered the information for each one of these 161 cases, and we compared this information with 7 different criteria. The criteria are the ones that you can see in this slide. And one of the criteria, as you can see, is if the project was successful or not successful. This will come of importance later. I will not go through all the criteria we used. I will focus on the business model criteria, that it's the one that this presentation is about. And for analyzing the business models of use in these 161 cases, we extracted the information of specifically how the transactions were done, who were the actors between the buyers of the ecosystem services and the sellers. And we put together 9 different models, depending on the actors and the types of payment. Georgia, please. We came up with 9 different models that can be divided roughly into 4 different classes, depending on who were the actors. We applied the statistical analysis to see which ones of the successful cases, or to say it in another way, to see which business models were driving the successful cases. Georgia? Another one, please. We found out that the cases that were using a combination of public sellers and public buyers, or a combination of private sellers and private buyers, were tending to be more successful than those where the actors were mixed between public and private. Now, this doesn't mean that it's designing the future cases with actors being public-public or private-private will not be necessarily successful, but it's an orientation of how this could be driven towards a more successful outcome. Also, on the other side, it doesn't mean that a combination of public-private will be always a non-successful case. However, it can give us indications on what can be improved in these less successful combinations, what can be improved to have a more successful outcome of the future cases. Georgia? And with that, I wanted to mention that approximately 1/3 of the cases, of the 161 cases, are PES or PES-like projects from Europe. And there was a comment from someone that in the chat that at the moment nobody is paying for ecosystem services. Well, 1/3 of this database are cases from Europe that someone has been paying for ecosystem services. So it sort of contradicts that comment that was in the chat before. And thank you for your attention.
Okay, thank you very much, Georgia and Nelson. Very quick presentation with perhaps surprising finding. We'll find out in the discussion, actually, if it is considered to be surprising. But if you can just say one quick thing about how did you define successful in this regard? Because you said it's private was successful, public was successful, the rest not really. What does successful mean?
Successful, we define it first considering if the original objectives of the project were met at the end of the project, and if additional benefits were achieved that were not included in the original aims of the project. These were successful cases. And non-successful cases were defined as those that didn't meet the original objectives of the project as defined by the project designers.
Okay, thank you very much to the two of you also for this clarification. I start again with Vaško, because this might, I don't know, does it come as a surprise to you? Because we're talking so many times about public-private partnership and the need for that, and as a means to overcome lots of the evils of the world and lots of the difficulties that we might have. And here, what we hear from the two is actually that that we have here much better situations if we keep in the private, and if we keep the public working with the public institutions. Does that reflect your experience? And what do you say about this?
That's the easiest business model, let's say, to keep the things separated. But I think where you create really synergies and replicating things and mobilize private capital is exactly when you mix those. It's not, they're not the easiest ones, but we have experience on doing those. We are working, for example, in the forest project in Spain, where we have the regional government involved with a private company, where basically the private company is interested in bioeconomy, let's say, of the forest, and the public entities is interested on enhancing the forest ecosystems and health. So the idea is basically you set the rules, you set the governance, but they can work together for the benefit of the both agendas in this case. I think it's possible, but indeed you need to have you need to think through the governance in the middle, the alignment of interest, and you need to take time from the, I'm talking now from the banking side, you need to take time to set that properly.
So you're saying it's basically difficult, but worth it to try?
Yes, yes, for sure.
Okay, thank you very much, Vaško. And then let's hear from Paula. Let's hear from Marie-Alice. Sorry. Your reaction to this perhaps surprising result of public and private.
Yes, as you were saying, Mark, this goes against what we've been defending the public-private partnerships. But I don't have exactly a comment, but I would have a question. What are the next steps of your study? Are you going to investigate the whys of this apparently surprising results? Is it the language? Is it the projects you focused on, the area, the geographical area, the culture? I don't know what is behind these results, and I would like to know.
So
that's indeed. Go ahead, Nelson.
Okay, about the geographical area, these cases are from all over the world, and the thing is that it's very difficult to find cases reported as non-successful, or to find any information about non-successful cases. So the statistical analysis, even if it's an orientation towards the trend, cannot be a certainty. The great thing would be to find more cases that have been non-successful, to be able to compare at a more equal level and to extract better information. But facing the lack of better information, this is what we could provide. And as I said before, this is not a certainty. It doesn't mean that public-private arrangement will not work. It just means that there might be something wrong in what has been tried before, and maybe it would be worth to check on these cases that have not been successful with this arrangement, what was that didn't work in those specific cases. So it's not about saying no to these arrangements. It's about saying, okay, what could we improve here?
Thank you very much for that clarification. So at least it doesn't seem to be obvious how to achieve that public-private combination and cooperation here in this area. Marie-Alice, your comment. Are you there? Or yes, you are.
don't quote me, but there are some EC funds existing which are not used by forest owners. So there are some public money, but they are not tailored for easy use by forest owners. This needs to be fine-tuned and more orientated to be easier for the managers to be used. The experience of ELO, we are covering all EU countries, including UK, and I can share with you that public-private is functioning. So it's interesting to see the difference with what was presented and the experience we are sharing with you. Why? Because public funds cannot do everything. There are lots of other emergencies to be solved by the authorities, and so it's important to have a good part from public funds and the rest by private funds. But from what was said before also, to attract private funds, it needs to be bankable. So you need to have the researchers demonstrating what the private is paying for. It's a question of size also, ELO is working at that. All the success stories we can share with you today is that when well organized, purely public funds is functioning, but we know it's not forever and it's limited. We cannot always count on this. A mix of funds is important from our perspective, and somehow it's corporate social responsibility. This means that there is a contribution from other sectors to the forest sector and the ecosystem services. The mention I made on we are not paid for ecosystem services is because I was speaking about purely ecosystem services, not specific biodiversity ones. So there are funds for biodiversity, there are CAP funds for forest to avoid landslides. So, but it's scattered. It's you have the slices of the sausage, but not the entire sausage. So you are always missing some ecosystem services in it. And when you are speaking about recreational ecosystem services, the money goes to the bed and breakfast, the hotels, all the sector, but not the doers.
Okay, all right. No, thank you very much, Maria.
Working in the forest. So
thank you very much, Maria.
We need the public-private functioning. And if you need further explanation, I'm willing to have.
Well, definitely will continue the dialogue. I hope that will continue. But we're going to go for a final round of comments from the chat, and perhaps the final round of comments from participants, if they like to. Just as a short remark, Maria-Lise, the general, let's say, the accessibility and easiness of getting EU funds may be a subject on its own. That is not necessarily only something that landowners might struggle with. I think also the group of people represented here can talk a little bit about that, but that's not our subject for today. Katerina, any comments to share from the chat, and perhaps some final comments for participants before we move to a close, unfortunately?
Yes, thank you very much, Mark. In principle, the chat discussion also centered around when will this study be available and how can we get it, because there seems to be a lot of interest in getting more details on the results, and it will be shared as soon as it's finally done. And Georgia and Nelson, of course, are the first ones to share the news and share the document. And then there was a bit of a follow-up discussion on the point that you made earlier, Mark, on how you define success and how difficult that is to actually do that. Nelson gave a bit more of an insight in what they use to measure that. So really that it is about documents that the projects and the initiatives put forward as project reports, but also as public scientific publications just shortly after the project ended. So, but it is of course not an easy task, and I think that was widely acknowledged also in the chat there.
Okay, thank you very much for that. And indeed, I think what we have learned in this session, and is in one way a pity, right? This is actually so many interesting issues we could continue to discuss about, and we will outside the framework of this session and this conference. But we really learned, I think, quite a lot today in terms of that we are actually at perhaps even at a crucial time, perhaps, Paula, if you said that. Hopefully I don't put words in your mouth right now, but something of a quite important moment in time where we see a change of demand that is actually put forward towards forest ecosystem services, and where, let's say, the financing models aren't perhaps quite there yet, and where there is a shift also in terms of what is happening there in view of the whole decarbonization, Green Deal, and I heard as well Black Deal, oh my goodness, approaches that we are having here. Perhaps there's a contrary movement at sometimes as well. But there is this critical moment, perhaps, that we have a crucial moment in the development where we need to look carefully in what are, Katharina, indeed the successful cases. How do you define success? How do you look at income streams? And how do you actually, and then make sure that what comes out is of benefit for society at large, where we solve the big problems, but we also have a lot of players on the ground, including the landowners, including companies that are busy there, that are doing their job, and all this entire system has to function. I know there are perhaps even more requirements to and requests to say more points at the very end, but I feel we need to close our discussion here. Thank you so much to all the participants, to all the presenters, also daring to come out with points that are things that actually trigger really a discussion and perhaps get us a little bit out of the comfort zone. So much that we want to really know about the study in the next points and in the next phases. From our side, from my colleagues here at Prospects Institute, behind the scenes also with Dimitri and with Alba, and in front of the scenes with Katharina, Miro, and myself, a big thank you for these discussions. Also today, yesterday was the scientific part. Today we looked at practitioners, and in this session at the business cases. And I give the floor for the final words on this conference to the two project leaders of the two projects, Sincere and Nobel. And a big thank you to our panelists who've been with us here in this session for actually speaking out clearly, also their views on this. That's what we need to have this dialogue. But I need to give the floor in view of time now to Harald and to Georg for the closure.
Thanks a lot, Mark, for the opportunity to raise some thoughts. I think we had really intensive 2 days where the two projects were able to present some of the findings, and a lot of the activities are still ongoing and a lot of things are still in progress. I think also the last presentation that was given right now shows also the potential if two EU projects are joining the efforts in making a big effort in joining the databases and bringing together the knowledge and expertise and efforts from different scientists, from different partner institutions and projects to build a common database. I think that's also a key issue, what is quite innovative, and I think it's also a good idea to do that in a broader context. And there are a lot of things to continue. I mean, from the Nobel point of view, I can say, yes, we will have to continue with the collaboration with our stakeholders in the pilot demonstrations in order to further refine these business models, identify innovative forest management regimes, and make them work. We will further explore this policy framework and governance settings. We talked a lot about that. So what are the hindering factors? What are somehow the enablers which make such kind of business relations a success? And we will also explore these different design variables. So we were talking about the auctions as one example today of one mechanism that can be used to implement PACE schemes. And we will explore which of these design variables will really work in order to better understand the needs of the buyers in engaging in such kind of mechanisms. And yeah, last but not least, as we are also scientists, we are very much interested in bringing out our papers and publications. So that's why there was also huge interest already in some of these studies. So this is what will be engaged for the next year, that we will focus also on that issue. And yeah, hand over, Georg, to you, maybe for some closing words as well.
Yes, thank you very much, Harald. Well, it was an interesting afternoon and very interesting 2 days. There was a lot of information shared, and actually my last question to you, Mark, and colleagues from communication is if we can share the PowerPoints of these 2 days, but also perhaps the studies that were referred to in the chat with the participants if they're interested, because I think there was a lot of interesting information exchanged. From Cynthia's side, we are now moving into the synthesis phase of the project. There's a lot of the things we have heard about in the last 2 days that we now need to put together, looking into interesting business models, potentially, other innovations, but also looking into the EU policy framework, looking also what is one of the ideas we have in the final stage to put the experiences made in Europe in a broader global context. So please stay tuned. With Cynthia, there's a lot now coming out in the last 6 months of the project that could be interesting for several of you. I would like to mention 3 events. On 15th of November, there's a Japanese European symposium that we are organizing together with Japanese partners from research and forest management practice, exploring the importance of cultural forest ecosystem services towards new business opportunities. This is really interesting, I think, for the European people, forest people or forest environment people, because in Japan a lot is happening with cultural forest ecosystem service. There's a lot of innovation potential, and I think that can be really interesting exchange of experiences, and a lot can be potentially taken up from this highly industrialized but also quite innovative country in terms of forestry affairs. There will be a policy-oriented workshop on the 23rd of November, and then finally a dissemination event, possibly in February, March. In Cincy, we have to see if again also Nobel will be partnering us, perhaps even they already closed the InnoForest project, where the idea is to present some of the key outcomes, final outcomes, especially to policymakers. Let's see if we can do this live in Brussels. Well, this is on the Cynthia side. I would like, on behalf of both of us, of Nobel and Cynthia, like to close with really thanking very much to all of you, to all speakers, to all those that have been working in the background, and to all those that have been so active in the chat. It was really interesting. To the entire Cynthia and Nobel teams. And last but not least, also to our panelists and speakers and the moderators. It's always nice to see, Mark, how you do these events. And I know you do many, many different events in many, many different branches, but still I have sometimes the feeling that you are a real expert on forest ecosystem services. At least you have become that, you and the Prospects team in the last year. Thank you very much. It was really interesting. And perhaps you can say a quick comment about this information sharing, because I think there's a lot that could be distributed. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Georg, and Harald, thank you so much for these kind words as well. And yes, we'll do our best to from our side to share the information that has been brought forward and the links, etc. And we'll work together with the communication partners at FE and at the projects involved in order to make this happen, so that you get this information. We'll probably share something in the chat, perhaps to for those who would like to voice their interest and see if we can distribute it the way that we have already collected, I think, from FE side, the participants list. So we'll try to follow up on that. Right. Thank you very much. Have a great afternoon. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks a lot. Congratulations for the event.